I want to welcome you to this Chancellor's Forum this morning, and it's my joy to introduce to you two of the leading theologians in the evangelical world today. Dr. Albert Mohler, who was the speaker for the inauguration last week, is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. We were laughing together this morning that there was a time when people used to talk about how young we are, and they don't say that anymore. I said, used to we were the young Turks, and he said, yeah, we were the young Turks, but nobody says that about us anymore. One thing you may not know is when Al was elected as the president, the Louisville religious media was horrified and terrified. And at his first press conference, it was rather contentious, and one incredulous reporter said, Dr. Mohler, you're only 33 years old. What do you plan to do? And he said, I plan to age. He literally said that. And we have, brother, we have aged. And he's still here, and most of them are gone. But we're delighted to have an Al. Please come on up and join me here. Also with us today is Dr. Derek Thomas. Dr. Derek Thomas is not only the Robert Strong Professor of Systematic and Pastoral Theology for Reformed Theological Seminary at the RTS Atlanta campus, he is the senior pastor of the historic First Presbyterian Church of Columbia, South Carolina, one of the great pulpits of the Reformed and Presbyterian world. Dr. Thomas, please come up and join me. We're in close fellowship this morning. I want to introduce the two of you to some folks who may not know you. And I don't know a better way to do that than to ask you to tell just a little bit about how you came to faith in Christ. And so, Derek, would you tell the story of how you came to trust in Jesus?
I'm in my early 60s, so I was born in 1953. I was a teenager in the 60s. The Beatles and so on just kind of passed me by, but it's part of my story. I did not grow up in a Christian home, never went to church. It was modernity and the beginnings of late modernity, but it wasn't just wasn't part of my life. I had one encounter with church when I was 13. I was coming home from school. My mother met me at the school bus, which was unusual. And it was a late winter afternoon. You remember Scotland, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's dark. And my mother said, I said to my mother, why are you here? And she said, well, I'm going to get you christened. And I said, what? So we went down to the Anglican church. It was a Wednesday, Thursday afternoon, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course, no heating. And all I remember is the vicar reading out from some liturgy, and I could see his breath. And the font in an Anglican church is at the side door. And he muttered some words, christened, baptized, whatever, and I thought to myself, I'm 13, 14, if that's what Christianity is about, I don't want it. And that was my brush with formal, institutionalized Christianity. And I was 18, I was a sophomore at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth. I was studying physics and mathematics. That was my major, double major. And my best friend, how long do I have? My best friend in school, Richard, was also studying physics and math, but at a different university. He and I were obsessive about classical music and opera. And that, it's tough to like opera when you're 13, 14 in high school, when the only thing that you can do is play rugby or cricket, and you want to talk about classical music and opera. It was tough. And he sent me in the mail. We were best friends. It's probably the closest friend I've ever had in my life. And he sent me in the mail John Stott's Basic Christianity. It arrived in an envelope. He wrote on the inside of it, "Dear Derek, I've become a Christian. I would love you to read this book, Richard." That's all it said. And I thought, what has become, the verb threw me. Well, I become a Christian. I thought, well, this is a Christian country. Yeah, hey, I was christened when I was 13. So I think if anybody else had given me the book, I probably wouldn't have read it. I was into Isaac Asimov and science fiction, and I just didn't read Christian books. I'd never read the Bible. I didn't possess a copy of it. And I read Basic Christianity. And 2 days later, I'm on my knees begging the Lord to save me, because if I died, I was going to hell. I'd gone in 24 hours, 48 hours, from really not believing in hell or having a thought about Christianity to saying, something like the sinner's prayer. I can't remember what I said. I think I asked Jesus into my heart or something. And then what? I had no idea what to do. So I went to the Anglican church. And where else would you go? And I said to the vicar after the sermon, I said, I've become a Christian. I've been saved, I think was the language I used. I've been saved. And he looked at me and he said, no, you haven't. Come and see me tomorrow. And I thought, well, that's odd. So I went to see him the next day, and we had tea and biscuits, what you'd call cookies. And we talked about politics and sport and, all kinds of things, but not Christianity. And as I was leaving, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, Derek, too much religion is a bad thing. And he gave me Paul Tillich's The Shaking of the Foundations to read. And, I read this book and I thought, I can't make any sense of this book. I have no idea what this guy is saying. And I gave it back to him the following week, and I didn't think much more of it. Actually, it was here in RTS Jackson as a student. I got the book out from the library again, and I thought, what he did? It was satanic. It was like trying to snatch the seed away when I didn't know any better. And so I went back to college. This was all during the Christmas break. I went back to college, and I remember seeing on a notice board an advertisement for what I had called in my first semester before I was a Christian, the God Squad, the InterVarsity Fellowship Christian Union. And they met on a Saturday evening in the Students' Union above the bar. You can drink when you're 18 in Britain. So colleges on a Saturday night are mostly drunk. But the Christians, the God Squad, met above the bar. And I remember, that's where I need to go. And I walked in, and I met my brothers and sisters. And my family were dysfunctional, and my parents were divorcing, and so my late teenage life was emotionally kind of a roller coaster. And I met my brothers and sisters. And they said, where are you going to church tomorrow? This was Saturday night. And the word Anglican came out of my mouth. And among the folks that replied was my wife. She was a math major, and it was like an instant response. They said, "No, you're not. You're coming with us to the Baptist church." And I knew you'd like this. There was a minister in the Baptist church called Jeff Thomas. He had just graduated from Westminster Seminary in 1964, and this was 1972. And I went in that morning, and I got a 55-minute sermon from Matthew's Gospel, and I'd never heard anything like it. It was just riveting. Well, there was a whole lot more, but that's how I was converted.
And I think you've gotten a picture of some of the things that animate Derek's life and ministry, even from hearing that testimony, his concern for the gospel. No wonder the man loves John Bunyan and has commended Bunyan to so many decades of Christians because of his own experience. And also the wonderful ties that exist in the evangelical Reformed world between our Presbyterian and Baptist brothers. Many people don't know that the father of American Presbyterianism in the South was the son of Welsh Baptist parents. And so here Derek Thomas is, one of the great teachers of the church with the similar kind of lineage. And I think that'll help you understand some of the things he's going to say later today. Al, your experience is very, very different, but equally interesting because of some of the people that you encountered along the way in your growth in the Christian life. Tell us a little bit about your background and coming to faith in Christ.
The folks in my generation in Jackson, Mississippi can probably identify with my experience as much as any place on earth. I grew up in the Deep South in a tall steeple Southern Baptist church, pipe organ, pulpit so central that the senior minister of the church was concerned that musicians might move it, so he bolted it. So that musicians couldn't even move the pulpit. It's there, inviolable, immovable. And that was the bulwark of my life. I had two godly parents who were just totally committed Christians to the extent that I was enrolled as a fetus. We actually, back then, enrolled fetuses in the Southern Baptist Convention. It was called pre-cradle roll, which meant when your mother was expecting you, they started praying for you, just named baby Mohler. And I still have a certificate filled out for baby Mohler, expected October 1959. That was before ultrasounds and all the rest. All it was baby. They had no idea. And then I was in cradle roll, and there may be some in here who remember I was a sunbeam. If any of you had Southern Baptist friends, and went through everything. I was in every imaginable church program, and that was just what our family did. And that was such a rich heritage. There never was a time when I wasn't surrounded by the preaching of the Word. There never was a time I wasn't surrounded by wonderful Christian people. And then I think about young people. I think a lot of the young people at my seminary, and I realize as young people, they never were around the most marvelous, warm-hearted, convictional Christian people who just loved me. I had hundreds of parents, in that sense, and others, and it was a completely healthy world. But I was lost, and I really didn't know I was. Even though the gospel was being preached clearly, it really had not reached me as a sinner. I knew I sinned. I'd never known myself as a sinner until I was 9. And I was not in our church. Our church, the pastor had a PhD, big pipe organ, the whole thing. But growing up in the South, and some of you remember this, you didn't go to vacation Bible school at your church alone. You went to everybody's vacation Bible school, which I think was one way back in the 60s when I was actually an elementary school kid, where parents had a safe place to put you in the summer. My mother had a lot of kids in the house, and so vacation Bible school is a great deal. But a bivocational preacher, and in homiletics we would call him a suck and blow preacher. And then he just let loose. Jesus was a polysyllabic word, three or four syllables. I'd never heard anything like this before. He was a part-time phosphate miner, part-time preacher, and he'd just come in to preach. He'd taken time off. He was wearing his work clothes, had a lunch pail like my granddaddy, and he preached the gospel in such a simple way that sitting there as a 9-year-old, I all of a sudden realized it's not just that I sin, I am a sinner. And I was just undone. And so I just grabbed a hold of Christ. He promised Christ saved. I didn't know what else to do, And through a process of time, I really will tell you, I believe that I was converted to Christ then out of desperation. I understood grace, couldn't have defined anything except what I've been taught all my life, which now took on a whole new significance. And things were happy for me. From that point onward, my experience with the church was only happier until I was 15. And then I had a tremendous apologetic challenge. It just hit me. My parents wrenched me out of a very secure environment, and my father's business life took him to a different place. We were in Fort Lauderdale. And it was Fort Lauderdale in the 1970s. It was sheer chaos in terms of worldviews. And a lot of people can't remember this now because people think about religious pluralism now, the way we talk about it, that's a huge issue. Well, in Fort Lauderdale, it was people everywhere. You had Moonies on the street, Hare Krishnas. People were passing out the Bhagavad Gita as it is, still the strangest title of a religious text I know of, in high school. And then I had a 10th grade history teacher who was an atheist and was teaching atheism. And this was, religious pluralism in my neighborhood growing up was having a Presbyterian family on the block.
And many of your best friends were Jewish.
Well, and Catholic. Yeah, you're exactly right. So, I went into a situation where we were all Methodist, Presbyterians, and Baptists, mostly Baptists, to where now my best friends are the son of the Reformed rabbi and a Roman Catholic kid who, is seriously Roman Catholic, And completely sold out, pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic, And the three of us we were in an advanced learning program, and we had a great time together. But boy, was it a worldview carnival. And I would go over to study at my Jewish friend's house, whose father was the rabbi, and that's when I discovered the rabbi didn't believe in God. And seemed to have what I would now call cognitive dissonance in not believing in God. I actually was shocked that I did. And so I'm a 15-year-old Southern Baptist arguing with a rabbi. And then I've got my Roman Catholic good friend. And this Roman Catholic friend he was a very close friend. And forgive me, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you this because this is how I became a theologian. Over the weekend, we were together. We're back on Monday morning, and I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "I lost my virginity over the weekend." Forgive me. And we were, 15, 16 years old. And I said, "What?" And my first thought was, "And you're alive," which I wasn't sure would be true. In my case, I was sure would not be. And so, but I'm already feeling haunting guilt for him. I'm feeling transferable guilt, and I'm saying, "What are you going to do about this? You're going to hell." And he said, "It's not a problem." I said, "What do you mean it's not a problem?" He said, "Well, I went to confession on Saturday." I said, "Tell me more." And he said, "I got full absolution from the priest." I said, "He can do that?" And he said, what all of a sudden struck me as a teenager is I'm talking to a kid who's a very dear friend of mine who I know believes in God and is the most seriously minded Christian intellectual I knew. He had read stuff I'd never, he was operating at a different level. And then his understanding of the gospel and the priesthood and the sacraments, all this, it all landed on me as a huge explosion. And I'm realizing that is not what my youth pastor is going to say, I can tell you that. And this is not the way this is going to go. And so I started reading. I went and started looking things up. We didn't have Google. So I went to the school library and started looking this stuff up. I looked up absolution. I'd never heard of it before. And I'm looking at it thinking, that's not going to work. I've read the Bible. That's not going to work. I'm not sure exactly how to explain this, but that's not going to work. So my first theological debate was with the son of an agnostic rabbi and a true sacramental pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic kid. And then I just lost confidence. I actually did. All my instincts were framed by Scripture, just being raised by Christian parents, and I just didn't have the intellectual ammunition. I couldn't answer why these things. And then what really got me, Lig, and we've talked about this so many times, was epistemology. And Elaine is thinking, well, how do at least he has a pope who says this is what these things mean, and he's got a magisterium in his church, and I've got a pastor. That's not that those don't seem to be equivalent things. How do I know any of these things? Then that threw me in a complete, forgive me, this is too long, but that threw me in a complete black hole. Because then I'm thinking, how do I know anything? How do I know there is a God? And I can still remember thinking this question, framing it this way in the horrible dark nights when I couldn't sleep. And I was thinking, well, maybe there is a God. I was never tempted with atheism. Even just the argument from design, it just made that impossible to me. But maybe he's unknowable and he doesn't talk. How do we know the Bible's his word? So I went to my youth pastor, completely freaked him out. He was not equipped for this. He was just a graduate from college. He could play the guitar, had a cute wife. Wonderful, godly young man, great influence in my life, but didn't help me in apologetics at all. And I went to see my pastor. This is a different senior minister. This is now in a Southern Baptist megachurch. Pastor, warm-hearted, great pastor, great preacher of the gospel, no apologetic. His answer to me was, you'll be reassured to know that many smart and intelligent people in the history of the church have struggled with these same questions. No, that doesn't help. Did they get to any answers? That's what I need to know. That's like saying lots of people, once the boat have sunk, have tried to swim. That doesn't necessarily get you to any point of safety. And so my youth pastor picked me up one day in his VW van, complete with the shag orange carpet. And this is in a day in which my parents would have been completely untroubled by me just getting out of school and jumping in the youth pastor's van and driving off. That's how much trust we had, and this man was very trustworthy. He had met another youth pastor in a church of another denomination, and what's so interesting is this guy had just graduated from Westminster Theological Seminary with a degree in apologetics. And so my youth pastor picks me up and says, I met a guy who likes to talk about the stuff you're asking about. And he just dumps me at the feet of this guy who was the youth pastor at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale. And he just started answering the questions. I mean, without any hesitation. And he was excited about it. I mean, what just gave me more reassurance than anything was, here's a very smart young Christian who is just really excited that I've shown up to talk about this stuff. Evidently, he woke up this morning hoping I'll get to talk about this stuff. And that just, it wasn't just many wise and intelligent people struggle with this. I mean, this guy wants to talk about it, and he's got answers. And he was really a gift. And so I started going to his presentations and things. He introduced me to the senior pastor, Jim Kennedy, who took a real personal interest in me, kind of adopted this Baptist kid. And then he introduced me quite literally to Francis Schaeffer. And Schaeffer's lectures at Wheaton, he is there and he is not silent. That just frames exactly what I was looking for. He is there, he does talk, he is not silent. And I think I was made an apologist by being thrown into a program where I had to figure out what it meant to be a Christian in conversation with the son of an agnostic rabbi and with a Roman Catholic. And it just made me a theologian and an apologist.
Just listening to both of your testimonies, it is so evident looking back what God in his providence was preparing you both for. You didn't realize it at the time, but God was crafting you to serve his people for the rest of your lives in precisely these areas, in your own personal experiences. And the people that he brought into your lives, that friend who gave you John Stott, Jeff Thomas, who poured good preaching into you, Jim Kennedy, who invested a man who's pastoring one of the fastest growing churches in all of the evangelical world, invests himself in a young man who then turns around and invests himself in an entire generation of servants of the Lord in the same way to provide those kinds of answers and leadership. It's remarkable to see God's providence.
And sometimes you meet yourself somewhere else. I had the opportunity to be taught by Heiko Obermann, great Reformation scholar at one point. And he was talking about Luther, and he said, Luther's a teenage boy, by his own writings, was kept up late at night, unable to sleep, struggling with these questions. And it said it made him a theologian, and I realized that's kind of how it happens. I was 16, 17 years old, couldn't sleep, worrying about these questions.
It also underlines for me constantly that whilst apologetics is a good and proper discipline, and we need to have answers, we need to give a reason for the hope that lies within us, but it also constantly reminds me of just the sheer power of Scripture. Because I went from a complete pagan to reading Scripture. Actually, I wasn't reading the Bible. I was reading quotations from the Bible in John Stott's book because I didn't possess a Bible. But just the sheer power of a biblical text. Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And even today, when you're engaged in evangelism and you kind of despair because of the cognitive dissonance or whatever, you remind yourself just the sheer power of the Word of God to break through into someone's heart and life.
And for those of you who are seminary students here this morning, I mean, you've just been reminded again why you're doing what you're doing, so that you are there when the next Al Mohler or the next Derek Thomas as teenagers are working through these kinds of things. And you can bring to bear the truth of God, the Word of God, and answers from the Word of God to these deep and searching questions that people still have. And so it reminds us of why we're here and doing what we're doing.
Lincoln, could I add one additional word? I also want to affirm, especially for seminary students, mine and yours, anyone who may hear, the context of pieties are really important here too. Because I was able to hear the truth from people who I could see live it and could see such joy in them. And that really brought, I had an atheist teacher who was trying to preach atheism. There was no joy in it. But when I was around these Christians who were dealing with, they were able to answer my questions, many of them that came into my life. But it was in a context in which I could see there was an abundant joy. There was a real following of Christ going, a real discipleship here. That matters too, hugely.
I want to talk to you both a little bit this morning about resources for the Christian life and about trends in the church and in the culture today. These are things that both of you have given many, many years to thinking about, writing about, speaking to. And let me begin with you, Al, and talk with us just a little bit about trends that you see in our culture now that we need to be aware of as believers.
Wow. Well, I think if we're just talking about the age, we need to recognize that 15 years ago, we'd be talking about postmodernism, and that's now passé even in the academy because it was an untenable temporary position. That kind of relativism begins to undercut itself, and undermine itself. It hasn't gone away. It's just situated itself now in a very toxic intellectual atmosphere. What we now know is that there wasn't any such thing as postmodernism. What there was the glaring reality of late modernity. And now we know that the modern age went through at least 3 stages, and we call it late because here we are. But you had the Enlightenment, and then you had the middle age of modernity in most of the 19th and 20th centuries, and now you got the exhaustion of what's left when the Enlightenment has pretty much run its course, and every subjectivist, relativist, every hermeneutic of suspicion, when all those things are run their way, this is what's left, and it turns out it's not much. And so there's just a huge moral and philosophical exhaustion. I mean, that's seen in the fact that, for instance, the colleges and universities don't know how to teach anymore. A lot of the discussion about the disappearance of the liberal arts is that no one really believes this stuff anymore. And they're not even able to speak about what's most important when the liberal arts are what framed the worldview and reality throughout, the last 2,000 years of Western civilization. And so we're living at a time of enormous exhaustion, and what gets exhausted is everything that matters most. So we talk about things like secularization. That's really important. But secularization, we now know, is more the result than the driver of what's happening. Because it's more that secularism comes in when theism is exhausted, or when theism departs, when confidence in God and revelation and the entirety of revealed Christianity, when those things leave, it turns out what the Protestant liberals hoped would be left would be a residue of Christian moralism and meaning, and all those things have evaporated. So you have a writer like John Updike, who seems, now a deceased writer, who seems in the history of American literature in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century to have just understood that. It's just gone, and there's really nothing in its place. And so what comes in that is an inevitable set of revolutions. The moral revolution we're experiencing now is inevitable once theism declines, because it turns out that the only binding authority in morality, we're supposed to know this, right, is God. And it turns out that the fear of God is indeed not only the beginning of wisdom, it is also the ground of morality, or at least any morality of don'ts. And when you have personal autonomy as the idolatrous great central theory of human existence, then everything has to give way. And the rebellion against God's created order, because that is actually what's going on here. It's not just against God as moral lawgiver, it's God as creator. And it struck me, and I'm writing a book on this right now, as you know, it struck me that that's really what's going on here. And that's exactly what Calvin and the Institutes would tell us to expect would go on. You have to kill off God the creator if you're going to kill off God the moralist. Because if he created it as a moral universe, and it has a design that implies a certain pattern, like between men and women and gender and sexuality and all the rest. So we're looking at what happens in an exhausted age when in the West, which had been cradled by Christian civilization, when that begins to fail, it leaves absolute emptiness in its wake, and that's a very toxic emptiness. And so we have the rise right now of erotic liberty at the expense of religious liberty. And so we've gone to the extent that religious liberty, which is guaranteed in the United States Constitution, is giving way to erotic liberty, which isn't even conceived in the U.S. Constitution. So again, Constitution is not going to save us. Courts aren't going to save us. And so there's this complete meltdown, and it's not over. The meltdown will continue because once secularization has its way, and by the way, a little footnote here, secularization in the United States is not secularization in England. Secularization in the United States is what Peter Berger calls cognitive contamination, a term I used in the sermon last night, where you keep going to church, or you say you go to church, or you keep saying you believe in God, but the worldview that you actually live by is so affected by other worldviews, you don't even recognize that it has no resemblance to Christianity, and perhaps even to theism. But you still, so people in Britain will look at you and say they don't know what Easter means. People in the United States will say they're planning an Easter meal, but they don't have a clue about the gospel. Well, what we're learning worldwide is something that, again, Augustine would have told us back in the 5th century, because David told us in the Psalms. Nature abhors a vacuum, so do civilizations. So we are watching the third crusade, era of crusades, I should say, undergo its beginning. And the great battle between Christianity and Islam is being fought without Christendom. And now Islam is going in. I mean, those of you who've been in Europe, you know there are neighborhoods in London where the police will not go. There are entire sections of Paris that are now dominated by Islam. Entire Belgian cities and cities in the Netherlands, even Denmark now. And you look at this and you realize it's not just a matter of numbers, it's a matter of cognitive commitment. It's a matter of intensity. And so, we were talking earlier about the fact that you've now got 15 to 20-year-old British schoolgirls leaving London and Edinburgh and Glasgow, Minneapolis and Toronto, and becoming jihad wives to 17 and 18-year-old soldiers in the Islamic State. And so modernity undermines itself and actually robs itself of its defenses against a genuinely strong worldview, which is what we see in the Islamic State. And so Lincoln, I'll simply say, this generation of young ministers is going to face pretty much the same kind of, the way I put it in a lecture last week was, if you put the early church and the challenges you see with Roman polytheism and the fall of the Roman Empire in the first 5 centuries of the church, you put that on the one hand, and then you look at the apologetic challenges of the Reformation and the early Enlightenment on the other hand, this generation is going to face those simultaneously. with Western secularism and its exhaustion on the one hand, and the rise of not only Islam, but some other, that's the dominant one, but some other worldviews around the world that are being held with an intensity and a conviction that outweighs an exhausted Christendom. Not the church, but an exhausted Christendom. That was more than you asked for, I realize.
Well, I want to come back to that in just a minute, and I do want to talk about, Al referred to a book that he's working on this called Aftermath, which is going to be coming out, and I want to come back and I want to pick up on that. I'm going to ask you, Derek, as we think about these big things that are happening in the culture, what are some of the things you see happening in the church? You came to the United States in the 1970s. You went back and ministered in Britain for 2 decades, and then came back to the United States again. You've seen a lot in that time, from the 1970s to today, in both the U.S. and in Britain. Things that you see happening in the church, good or bad, positive, negative.
Let me answer this first of all from a personal point of view. You know, what saved me was the gospel, but the gospel brought me into the church, and church was not a part of my life. But I think you said last night, you know, God has a plan, which made me think of Battlestar Galactica for some reason. But God has a plan, and it's called the church, and it yes, that's it. And you know, after a generation of seeker churches and half a generation of churches that are experimenting with its relevance to society, church is still the answer. You know, Matthew 16, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, the Caesarea Philippi statement. For me, the very center of what it is that Jesus is trying to do in the world today is building a church, and therefore, and seminary, of course, is part of that. It has a symbiotic relationship, and to the extent that it doesn't, the seminary becomes irrelevant. Its relevance is only true in its relationship, symbiotic relationship with the church, to feed the church and grow the church. You know, when I graduated from seminary, this seminary in 78, you know, church planting was something that a few people did, but they were kind of stellar folk. They were in a different universe to me. So I went back into a traditional church. It was a church of 100 members, sang hymns, regulative principle, sometimes dismissively referred to as the hymn sandwich, and call to worship, hymn, prayer, hymn, perhaps pastoral prayer, hymn, sermon, hymn, benediction. And that was it, and it repeated itself every week. But there's something about the stability of that. I mean, I say to folk, I don't want to be surprised on a Sunday morning. I want to be surprised by the power of the gospel and the power of the Word of God. But I don't want some freckly, pimpled-faced 21-year-old, you know, shocking me from out of nowhere on a Sunday morning. You know,
Take notes, students.
Tweet that.
I think in a culture that is so out of whack that the very stability of a Sabbath, you know, of a cycle of 1 in 7, and a worship service where we repeat, say, the Lord's Prayer, or we say the Apostles' Creed as we do, and it is such a countercultural moment. You know, when you hear 1,000 voices all simultaneously repeat the Apostles' Creed, and you want to say, do you realize what you're saying here? and all around you, there is no comprehension of what it is that you are saying. This multi-dimensional worldview, biblical Christian worldview that you're espousing. And I think that the stability of that is important. I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by a number of things. I'm encouraged by the young, restless, and reformed. I just wish they would grow up a little. It's time to grow up a little. But I'm really, really encouraged by. I was interested to ask Al, as Al does this thing so well of analyzing the culture, can he detect generational aspects? You know, we are products of the 60s, but are the products, other young men and women of the 80s and 90s sort of seeing the emptiness of late modernity and wanting more? And certainly among the younger generation in my church and the three churches I think that I've been associated with, I do find it's not just a generational objection that I think every generation. I was reading something from the 8th century BC this week, complaining about the young generation, and I thought, well, times haven't changed much. And but I wonder if at least a part of the analysis of our modern culture is that and part of the whole seeker-friendly and I've tried that, but it still doesn't come up with what I need, with what fulfills, with what integrates. Do you see that generational?
Well, yes, I think, and again, this is where we have to think more carefully than we've generally thought about this, because we're trying to look at recent social trends. But I think you're exactly right. You point back to a generation, and that means their formation is where this happens. I think American evangelicals tend not to recognize massive social influences on us. I mean, for instance, consumerism. The American consumer economy, it's not only, I didn't say materialism, that's there, and materialism is in one sense a constant. Temptation to riches is found everywhere in Scripture in the Old and New Testaments, but there's no consumerism. Consumerism treats the consumer as a consuming unit. It's the most important unit of moral meaning in the universe. And you can define your own moral meaning. You can describe who you are by the socks you wear. You know, all of a sudden there's a market among teenagers and 20-somethings in wild socks, you know. And it'll be something else tomorrow. It's just one thing after another. You are what you design out of all these consumer options, and you put them all together. And what people don't think about is that doesn't have just economic consequences. That has massive psychological and psychic consequences, emotional consequences. Because what happens when you do define yourself this way and it doesn't work? And so we have a generation, the generation now coming is entirely, and they're victims of a consumer culture that has exploded far beyond the way it was when I was a kid, when GM made 5 different car models, and they had slightly different chrome, and no one really thought, I'm expressing myself with a Buick. That wasn't it. But now it's a completely different thing, and so you have a generation burdened with a myriad of daily choices I did not have to make. I didn't have to figure out who I'm declaring myself to be by what color cover I have on my iPod, which I didn't have, which is already dating me. iPhone. And you look at this, you realize that's a part of it. So, and that's tied to a larger society that it's demoralization, it's secularization, it's all tied to the same complex, whereas personal identity now is reduced to big data, the cloud, who you are. These digital natives are live in a different social universe. We all know that. And the urgencies are the opposite of what they've been for almost all of human history. For almost all of human history, the urgency has been the proximate. That's not the urgency now. In other words, the urgency was the person in front of you or the person to whom you're most directly related. But now you've got teenagers who sleep with an iPhone hidden under their pillow because they're afraid to miss a text from a classmate in the middle of the night. That's right. So you look at this, you think, this is crazy. Now, every generation is crazy, Derek. I mean, Battlestar Galactica. And mine was the same thing. I mean, we're all crazy in our own way, but the limits on our ability to get too far outside the universe of meaning we'd inherited from our parents. Even the children of the 60s, which is one of the amazing things that sociologists look at now, the children of the 60s look a whole lot more like their parents of the 40s than their children look like them. The more radical change came after them. Late modernity is producing a culture in which you've got 29-year-old young men living in their parents' basement in their boxer shorts without a job or a wife or a plan. And are they responsible? Yes. I keep having to say this over and over again. They are responsible. But they are also what a society that is completely exhausted produces. So did that answer anything like what you were asking for?
Yes. I mean, I've taught at RTS for 20 years, and I've seen a change in 20 years as you analyze what's before you. And 20 years ago, there would have been much more hostility, antipathy, questioning in class of, say, strong Calvinism. And actually today I don't see that. As though there's a greater searching for something that's solid, true, that has foundation. So you can talk about limited atonement in a class, as I did a couple of weeks ago, and not one person balked at it. And this is a class mainly of late 20s, early 30-somethings. And I thought that's very different to the class that I would have attended in the 70s, where there was still a willingness to question radical, strong Calvinism. And I just wondered sociologically if that's a product of our age.
I'd love to speak to that for just a minute. It's the whole young, restless, or foreign thing, and don't worry about encouraging them not to be young at some point. They won't be young at some point. Again, my promise to age has been the best kept promise I've ever made. Here's my theory of that. The three of us up here, are still the products of a Christian culture that included nominal Christianity and what we would call cultural Christianity. And revivalism was a part of that cultural Christianity. A lot of the youth movements, Christian movements of the 60s, 70s, 80s, even in the 90s were a part of that. The megachurch is a part of that, simply because the megachurch can only thrive in a society that's culturally Christian. And you look at the evaporation of cultural Christianity is I said in my sermon last night, it's like a morning mist. It's burning off faster than we ever could have believed. Very important research being done in places like Atlanta and Birmingham, and I'm sure Jackson, Mississippi would be close to the same thing, is that what the demographers and the people, Pew's doing good work in this, Nork's doing good work in this, lots of other people look at this, because here's the problem. We were asking questions of the population, and it turns out that's not it. It's trajectory tracking. So in even a city like Jackson, Mississippi, if you talk to 50-something parents, you're going to get one response. If you talk to 18-year-olds in their homes, they're going to respond more like 18-year-olds in Seattle. And so secularization is happening fast, the evaporation of cultural Christianity. So during a time of cultural Christianity, you've got a lot of people who see Christianity as a rather ambiguous whole that has lots of debatable parts. And so the discussions that you and I grew up in were amongst people who thought Christianity is this rather, and you can see it, by the way, in the evangelical publishing world. You can see it in systematic theologies published, and without naming names. I mean, you look at what was the dominant systematic theology during the 80s. It was a book that said, here are all kinds of evangelical options. You will not see that again. Or if you do, it's a relic of the past. And it's because under the current intellectual conditions, if you've got a 23 or 24-year-old showing up at RTS or at Southern Seminary, they are saying, I want the real thing, all of it fast. And it's because there is no room. They're paying social capital like crazy just to be a Christian. What they need right now is everything deep. And that's healthy. I worry more about this generation 20 years from now or 15 years from now when I know what happens in middle adulthood is the recognition that it's not going to get better. I hope that makes sense.
We have to prepare people to endure. And
Yeah.
it's interesting how the New Testament is pitched in that direction for a long obedience in the same direction.
Right.
And because the pressure that you wake up day after day after day, and there's this looming toxic, poisonous air that you're breathing of unbelief in the world all around you. You have to put your feet on the floor believing deliberately, and you have to have the foundation for your belief that sustains that. And that's why that's another reason why seminary is so important for keeping faithful people in the game.
Yeah, one of the things I say to our students all the time is, look, I don't think you understand what you're up against. Because you're going to find out that what you're up against is a big, well, let's name them, principalities and powers. I mean,
Yes.
you're up against more than you think. And under these conditions, you talk about reaching the world. I want to encourage that with everything within me. But you are perhaps underestimating how much it's going to take to keep your own children.
Right.
Because in this cultural epoch, it is going to take everything we've got to hold on to a church. And if I weren't, again, that's why Calvinism, a Reformed theology, all of a sudden is the only option left, just because what else explains why anyone stays?
Right.
What else explains why anyone's here?
And there's also the sense that if I am up against something looming, something massive, I better have my own massive firepower to bring to bear, and some sort of equivocating, middling answer.
Right.
It is very apparent to this generation that is not the response.
Yeah, I mean, folk our age have seen what liberalism has done to the church in a way that perhaps another generation hasn't quite seen that, but we've seen the effects of liberalism on the church. We've seen the effects of it on seminaries. What was the article in the New York Times yesterday about the closure of a seminary? And if you haven't got anything to say, why would you go there? And the same is true of the church. But what encourages me about the modern church, and I see it through my own lens, of course, is once again the reinforcement of biblical theology, of sound theology, of the Reformed faith. And one of the most encouraging things for me last night, as I sat and listened first of all to Al and then to you, and I said to somebody afterwards, can you believe we have a room full of people all saying we believe in the inerrancy of Scripture? I mean, it's a spine-tingling moment in this culture to say, against all of the forces of unbelief out there, we believe the Bible to be inerrant. And that's the only future for the church, and it's the only future for the seminary.
Let me share with you one of the wisest things I ever heard. A pastor told me this once. Throughout the centuries of Christendom, many wise and intelligent people struggled with these issues. On the other side of an apologetic crisis, that helps again. And so when you go into my study, you walk past portraits of Luther, Spurgeon, Calvin. You're surrounded, as in your study, by people speaking loudly, clearly. I've got Augustine in his study, in his cell, and you know, busts and books and just constant reminders. You know, the doctors of the church of the medieval era. Just even there, I'm in conversation with them too. The fathers of the church, Augustine. You look at this, you realize, yeah, the firepower is here. That's why the young restless and reformed are restless and reformed. That's why they're reformed, is because they want someone who's actually been talking in a way explicitly scriptural, explicitly gospel, explicitly Christian, who isn't walking the earth right now. You know, I think it's one of the greatest things we can do is to hold up and say, look, and that's why last night when I was talking about it, I said, look, what we want is the faith that is the one holy apostolic faith. You know, we actually want to say the same thing. I don't want to say anything the apostles didn't say. I want to say everything they said. I want to say the same thing. I want every helpful thing the Reformer said, I want to say exactly that. If you ask me my theological tribe, I'm happy to say Baptist, Reformed, but I mean, you push me back, I'm going to say Augustinian. You know, I probably have more conversations with Augustine in a given week these days than anyone else. And where else in the world do you find people trying to say, yeah, well, there are a bunch of people who have been dead for hundreds and well over 1,000 years. We want to say the same thing they said. I'll be honest, I don't want to go to a cardiologist with that plan. You know, I don't. But when it comes to the great questions of existence, meaning, me, I really do. I want to say the same things they said when they were consistent with the Scripture.
We have a room full of trustees of the seminary here, supporters of the seminary students, faculty, others from the community. And the things that we have been talking about, the things that you've been teaching us, even in this delightful conversation, are things that flow out of your reading, your interaction with this great literature, and I want to give them resources to help them engage. Al, your briefing is something that, first of all, you invest an enormous amount of time and energy in that. It's a personal blessing to me. Would you tell them about the briefing a little bit and about the resources at albertmohler.com?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ligon. I did a national daily radio program for a decade and really enjoyed doing it, trying to bring serious theology and apologetics into daytime radio. And it was a success, but it was killing me. And given the fact I had another life to do too. And so we shifted, also just trying missiologically to understand where is the influence most needed. And so we went into the podcast because I'm far more interested in reaching people who aren't listening to a radio program in their car accidentally, but are intentionally trying to say, I need help with this, is what I'm doing. So we started the briefing 5 days a week, about 20 minutes of Christian worldview analysis of the pressing issues of that day. And that's an enormous bear on my back. But I have never done anything in my life that had more immediate effect. You know, we have, in a given month, we'll have about 500,000 listeners. And it all over the world. And that's just on the platforms we can trace. We can't trace. It's also now on broadcast radio in many places, which we just give away. And I mean, I just pour that into it because there are things that I don't have time to write. We need right now to talk about. I mean, on this morning's program, this PGP, you know, on college campuses, students being asked, what's your preferred gender pronoun? And even the people coming up with these policies saying, we're the first generation in human history to have to ask this question. Well, what does that tell you? And what do Christians think about this? How do we negotiate meaning and truth in a society in which on college campuses you're given 50 or 60 different gender pronoun possibilities and you can come up with your own? What is that about human identity? So that's why I spend time doing that daily on the briefing.
The briefing is a podcast, so people can sign up to have it downloaded.
It is, and if you listen to Ligoniers radio program, it's on there every day. But basically, it's on iTunes, Stitcher, Pandora, and as a podcast. And then at albertmohler.com, you can just push the button and it plays.
Not only is it compact, so in 20 minutes you can be up to speed on really important issues. Al has done sifting for you. One of the problems in our culture is we are inundated with trivial information. And you can spend your time, and just think about our mainstream media now and the utterly trivial things that will take up most of the news space in any given 24-hour cycle. Celebrity news of absolutely no consequence to anything in the world, while really serious things are happening here and around the world. Al will bring a Christian mind to bear in sifting through what is important, which will help you think about what is important as you're bombarded with the trivial, and will help you engage with others about the things that are important. And so I often will use Al as my temperature gauge for what's really important to be thinking about at a particular time, because of the things that he will select to focus on in the briefing. And the other resources at albertmohler.com, for those of you who like to read things, are topically organized as well. And he has regular posts on significant issues. For instance, the inaugural address last night that he gave is already up on albertmohler.com, and you can read it word for word. He was loading that on the plane, I think, as you flew into Jackson.
Yeah, and very quickly, I'll just say I have a long format interview program called Thinking in Public, mostly with secular intellectuals, which makes it fun. Alan Dershowitz, Steven Pinker, people like that. I like to talk to explicitly non-Christians on that program, and it's a very interesting worldview analysis, and also have an evangelistic concern, at least to be able to talk with people like that. Have one with former President Jimmy Carter on biblical authority. Trust me, that's interesting. So anyway, but because of the book project, I'm finishing a massive book. That's on hold. Also, my other podcast program, which is Ask Anything Weekend Edition, which is a lot of fun. And about 4,700 articles there. So thank you for mentioning it.
And you're in the middle of a book writing, of a project that's due out next year called Aftermath, which, along the lines of the way our conversation started today, is very relevant to where we are and where the folks that are sitting out here who are going into ministry are going to be living and ministering. So could you just give us a little taste of that?
I actually can, because the title really will say it. It's the title of the book is Aftermath. The subtitle is Life, Love, and Liberty in the Wake of a Sexual Revolution. And it's an attempt to do biblical theology, Christian ethics, and apologetics in terms of asking the question, what in the world has happened here, and what do we now do? Kind of how shall now we live, and think about these things. With the sexual revolution, and I tried to contextualize it earlier by saying, you can't start with the sexual revolution as the cause, it's the effect. But right now, it is the pressing issue that every single church, it's now the gospel-defining issue. We're going to discover who believes in the gospel or not in a big hurry.
I would just commend, there are very few authors that you can say, just go read everything they've written. Al is one of those people. You've got a book coming out on the Apostles' Creed. You've got a book coming out on the Lord's Prayer. And then Aftermath, in a couple of years, there's another huge project looming.
It was part of the same.
Yeah.
And the publisher convinced me it had to be split off because it was simply going to be too big. Aftermath's already over 100,000 words. It's entitled The Secular Moment. And it's the question, does evangelical Christianity have a future in a secular age? And the answer is going to be no if you're looking at evangelicalism, yes if you're looking at the church. So I'm looking forward to writing that.
Some people have said that liberalism lost the church and won the culture.
Yeah.
What's your thinking on that?
No, I think that's, Dave, the argument being made by some recent secular historians. They'll simply ask the question, if you take the editorials published in the Christian Century in the 60s and those published in Christianity Today, who won the culture? Well, it's Christian Century, not Christianity Today. But the problem with theological liberalism as a strategy, let's forget theology a moment. We can't really do that. Let's just bracket it for a moment. Let's forget that we're concerned with theology, and let's just look at pragmatically how it fared. It's a disaster, because it turns out in a secularizing age, a secular culture doesn't need a secularized church. And that was put brilliantly in a thing I'm going to talk about on the briefing next week from Germany, in which the German Bundestag is discussing whether to end the church tax. And the reason they're doing it is because they can't figure out why anyone should pay taxes for this thoroughly secularized church. We don't need it. And the other thing I thought about, by the way, Derek, I'd love for you to talk about this. When you look at the theological liberalism you mentioned, It took a generation. You read B.B. Warfield, and you look at the early response to theological liberalism in its American English-speaking form. It took a generation for it to show up as crazy as it fully became. It only takes about a week now. And so some of these people, you have younger evangelicals who are flirting with some, or who call themselves evangelicals, flirting with the same stuff, but, Lig, you and I talk about this all the time. It used to take a generation for them to go completely nuts. Now it's pretty much by Friday. And, they put up a blog post saying, do we really have to believe in this? And the next thing you know, they're marrying someone of the same gender. I mean, it's just like that. So that's what the modern age is doing. It just, this late modernity, all the defenses and the boundaries are down, which is why, and forgive me, but we were talking about this, and being 75% cool isn't going to work. And that's what all these evangelicals are trying to do. They're saying, these old evangelicals, the old Reformed, biblical, gospel evangelicals, they're sticking the muds. We're going to be cool. Well, the problem is they're only like 75% cool.
Right.
In a world that's got options of 100% cool.
You can't throw enough over the side of the boat to be cool and remain Christian in any identifiable sense.
Right.
Until you throw the whole ball of wax over the side,
right.
you can't be cool.
The problem with instant technology and instant information, and there's an enormous plus. An absolutely enormous plus. If only I had access to the information that I now have back in the 70s. I wouldn't have spent hours and hours doing stuff that I did in the library. But the downside of instant information is that it has a perception of a shelf life and a sell-by date, and it's tomorrow. And I think the church has to be so very careful here to maintain its counter-culturalness in terms of historiography, that we are rooted to the past. We have a link. That's why the Apostles' Creed has become more and more important to me, because it's a statement that I'm rooted to the 8th century, possibly the 5th century, and possibly the 4th century, and that's hugely significant. There's Al, and then there's the rest of us, and so I can't enter that world. Most of us limit ourselves, and if you're sensible, if you're a busy pastor, you need to limit yourself. You need to spend time studying. You can't be tweeting and texting and blogging all day, and then Saturday night you need to write a sermon. But Al has done us all an enormous favor here, finding one trustworthy source. I don't have the ability, nor do I have the time to read all the things that Al reads or interview all the people that Al interviews, but you have one trusted source of information about a lot of things. And Al's not infallible, though close, but he's not infallible, and he's not inerrant. But just having that one source, I limit myself to 3 or 4, and that's it. I don't want to be hopping from one blog to the next blog and just, there's an idol of just wanting to be so culturally relevant that what everybody has said within the last day. And so I read Kevin DeYoung's blog. Yes. He's a dear friend. You find somebody with whom you when you read, you think, yes, I want to think like that. I want to reason like that. Right. So there's Al's, there's Kevin DeYoung's. I've been involved, as Lincoln has been involved in Ref 21, and I'm still behind the scenes, though behind the scenes these days, but I'm still involved in that, and I read that. It's kind of quirky, but I read that, and it's informative for me. I read David Robertson, who I disagree with a lot on a lot of things, but it's one of those things that I read to sort of give you, well, let me hear a counter view, and often David gives me a counter view from within my world. It's like what newspapers do you read? Well, if it's Al, it's all of them. Coming off the plane yesterday, he had every newspaper that world prints, and they're in the back. But for me, I limit myself to one, because my time is really precious, and I could be doing this all day. I could answering this email, answering this text, making sure I've tweeted, making sure I've got something relevant to say on a blog, and I really have to discipline myself. And trusted sources, and those are some of them for me. That's important.
So you got to tell us now. What's your newspaper? Guardian, Times, or Telegraph?
Telegraph.
Ah,
The
see,
Daily
see,
Telegraph.
for my British friends, Derek has now identified himself.
Well, the Daily Telegraph is still culturally Christian, moral. It's still going to be politically to the right, which is probably where I am. It's a kind of safe read. It's a little snobby in parts, but they have a great crossword, which I've done for 40 years or more.
It's the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times in the British framework.
Only like everything in the British media, more so.
Right. Derek, you have also, you've written dozens of books informing the Christian mind over the last 30 years. I was watching with interest over the last 3 years as the ascension has become a really hot topic amongst evangelicals, and they've complained about evangelicals have never paid attention to ascension. Well, you wrote a book on the ascension 20 years ago. And John Bunyan has been an especial love of yours. You have given lectures on Pilgrim's Progress in the context of the church. You've done it in the context of the seminary. And you're writing a book on John Bunyan right now for a series of Christian sort of theo-biographies that Crossway is doing. Would you talk a little bit about Bunyan, your love for Bunyan, the book project, and maybe even the series?
When I was a student, just after I'd been converted, my wife, she is now, but my wife lived in an apartment with 3 other girls. They were just incredibly generous in terms of inviting other students back to their apartment for Sunday lunch. And I must have eaten 100 lunches there, discovered Rosemary was a great cook, so I married her. And by the way, even though I wasn't raised in a Christian home, Rosemary was the only girl that I ever dated. I never went on a date, ever. And she was the first one, and I was a complete idiot about how to go about this. So although I wasn't raised in a Christian home, I was raised in a very morally sheltered environment. In the 60s, which is surprising. But Rosemary's friend, Jane, used to buy books, Banner of Truth books. Banner were publishing Thomas Watson, J.C. Ryle, Richard Sibbes, Thomas Goodwin, all these Puritans were coming out. We're all familiar with them now, but in the 60s, this was a relative renaissance of republication of Puritan literature. Dr. Lloyd Jones was publishing his Roman series, Ephesians series in the 70s, and she would buy them, read them, and then give them to me because I was heading to seminary and I needed books. So I must have 30 books from Jane. But on my 21st birthday, she bought me a leather-bound edition of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and I still have it. I have.
Had you read it before?
No, I had not, and immediately fell in love with it. It was a road trip. Back in the 60s, I was 16. I read Lord of the Rings. I read it once a year, every year, since then, and it's a road trip.
Take note, Tim Keller.
Bunyan's tale, part 1. Was the one that I fell in love with, and it was years later before I discovered part 2 and the story of Christiana and the 4 boys, which is actually a different story. It's a family story. It's told from the point of view of a woman, but it also addresses certain things that Bunyan kind of left hanging in the first volume, some theological issues for which he has been criticized in the first volume. If there's only one book, apart from the Bible, that you really absolutely must read, and that's a difficult statement to make and answer, but for me it would have to be Pilgrim's Progress. And when I get to heaven and I see my Savior, I'm going to search out for John. I'm going to ask, where is John Bunyan? Because he is the most extraordinary man. This is a man born in 1628, dies in 1688, lives for 60 years. He's a teenager in the 1640s, in the time of the Civil War. He lies about his age, enters the parliamentary army. He saw battle as such. He certainly saw the effects of battle, but he's 16, 17, and then the whole story of his conversion, his marriage, his conversion, and then in 1660, his imprisonment at the time of the 5 Mile Act and so on, and just his refusal to comply with state legislation about preaching without a license, and he's sent to prison initially for 3 years, and then he ends up 12 years in prison, two separate, one lengthy one and another short one after that, in which he writes. He wrote over 60 volumes. His treatment on justification is incredibly deep. He makes a thing about never having really gone to school, never studied. I think he plays that card to his advantage. I think he's just one of these brilliant scholars, naturally gifted scholars. But Pilgrim's Progress, what I like about Bunyan is that when he's released from prison, he's married, he has 4 children, his blind daughter dies while he's in prison. I mean, this is incredible. But when he's released from prison, there's not an ounce of bitterness in him. Not an ounce. He's a warm, generous, loving father, husband, friend, colleague, and a generous Baptist, which I'll explain if you make me. But he's a generous Baptist, and everything about John Bunyan I like. He's a model pastor.
What did one of the greatest theologians ever produced in England, who was the Chancellor of Oxford, say about John Bunyan?
The reason why Pilgrim's Progress was published, he couldn't find a publisher, and it was John Owen. And John Owen's incredible by himself because he's on one side in the Civil War, and then after the Restoration, he's in the presence of the king. And how he pulls that off is fabulous in itself, a lesson actually about surviving in ministry. Not every hill is worth dying on, and you have to choose your battles, and John Owen certainly chose his. But he's having a conversation with the king, Charles II, who says something rather snobby about John Bunyan, and he says, "I would give all of my learning if I could preach one sermon like John Bunyan." And I would just love to be able to hear him preach. I would love that there was a little download that you can go to. I talk to students now who never knew Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. He's just someone he's a dead guy. And I say, they're free now. Download just one of his sermons. Download a sermon on Romans 3 or 4. Just download it. Listen to the voice. Listen to the gravitas. Listen to that logic on fire. Listen as it slowly develops and you're caught up cerebrally at first, and then your heart and emotions are involved, and then at the end it's like a crescendo of just inexorable logic. Well, I would just love to hear John Bunyan preach, but Pilgrim's Progress is important for so many reasons. It's important because of his understanding of the gospel, but it's important because of how he understands Calvinism. Bunyan is part of that 17th century Baptist Calvinist, no holes barred, pure, unadulterated Calvinism. But Calvinism pastorally applied, Calvinism in the church, Calvinism in answering some basic questions about law gospel. I mean, where are we today? We're on law gospel issues. I can't have a conversation. Almost every day, I'm encountering folk who think that the answer to legalism is a little bit of antinomianism, or the answer to antinomianism is a little bit of legalism, and they're going back and forth all the time. And I say, go and read Pilgrim's Progress, because the issue of law and gospel, and was it Melanchthon who said that he who understands the difference between law and gospel is a theologian, and I think that's why Bunyan is a theologian. Spurgeon criticized John Bunyan in a very famous sermon, unfairly, I think. I love Spurgeon. I mean, I absolutely love Spurgeon. Let me tell you a quick story. I was here on campus one day, and
you met Charles Spurgeon?
No, no. I had done worse than that. I had become a Presbyterian, and my dear friend, who still lives here, had also become a Presbyterian, and he had just bought the Pilgrim's publications, 66 volumes of the sermons, the Park Street Metropolitan. And he said, now that he'd become a Presbyterian, he didn't need these. He called me up one night and said, what do I do with my Spurgeon? I said, I'll be there in 10 minutes. So I did. I got in my car. It was an evening. I got in my car, went to him, and I put all these boxes in and I still have them. There was a time in my life, probably for 20 years, I doubt I preached a single sermon without, at some point, usually towards the end of the sermon, I would go and see, what did Spurgeon say about this text? And anyway, that's a side point. But he criticized Bunyan about how long it was that Christian had taken before he lost his burden, and kind of accusing Bunyan of being somewhat legalistic on that issue. And I think that's unfair. I actually think that part 2, the story of Christiana, makes it clearer what his intent was. He was giving a personal biography, I think, in Volume 1. He wasn't saying that everybody is converted in precisely this modality, that you have to actually experience this weight of sin for years and years before you can receive Christ.
When does this come out so we can read it?
Yeah. Yes, it's the due date has come and gone, and there's a certain Mr. Taylor who's on my case. This is Crossway. It's in that series. There's a volume on Kuyper, Bonhoeffer, Calvin. Mike Horton did the Calvin one recently.
Steve Nichols, your friend, is editing the series.
There's one on Edwards. I think there might be one on Lloyd Jones coming, and there's one on Bunyan.
And you think maybe next year or the year following, something like that?
Next fall.
Okay, good.
Do you have questions that you would like to ask Dr. Mohler or Dr. Thomas? Just raise a hand and I'll get you to ask the question. Ralph Lord.
Yeah. In today's society, you made a statement about certain parts of England, Paris, where you have the Islam, nation within a city there. And people go and they're dying for Islam. Certainly we have Christians dying for Christianity. But where in that equation do you get Christianity to want that type of listening?
How do Christians respond to the kind of readiness to kill and die for the expansion of Islam that you find within some parts of the Islamic community? Al, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. That's why I said what's new is that we're in a crusade without Christendom. Whereas when you had the Crusades take place, and by the way, the Crusades are like the historical problem of colonialism. It's almost impossible morally to unpack all of that. You know, what goods came out of it, what ills came out of it, but it happened, and there it was. And I'm going to be bold to say I'm glad we didn't lose the Battle of Lepanto, and I'm glad we didn't lose the Battle of Vienna. and Europe become Islamicized and made part of the Ottoman Empire. I'm thankful for that. I think there would not be this seminary or mine had that happened,
Right.
and I think for the cause of Christ it would have been a disaster. But then that's when you had Christendom. That's when you had Christian princes and you had Christian kings saying, our responsibility is to defend Christendom. We now have a completely secularized Europe, certainly in that respect. And we also have a demilitarized Europe. That's the other side of it. For instance, one of the most shocking news stories of the last 10 days has been the fact that Germany has 48 military helicopters and 7 of them work. This is Germany. We counted on them making things work. And it turns out that the German Navy can't even really field anything because they no longer feel any urgency for national defense. And politically, they can't spend more money on national defense. And that's just one example. So you have an exhausted, and that gets back to a biblical worldview point, which is you never exhaust part of a society. It just exhausts itself. It's because God created us as, we're not simply economic beings, we're not simply political beings, they're all put together, and when one's exhausted, they're all exhausted. So the answer to the question, I don't think there is any military strategy. And I think this is where, for instance, there are now people in the world, among world observers, who will tell you that the only reason the United States is standing up to the Islamic State is because there is a residual theological element to the United States that doesn't exist elsewhere. For instance, you have people in the United States, even secular liberals in the United States, including the president, who will use the word evil very reluctantly because evil has inherent theological overtones. And the president is here just indicative of an intellectual class that tries its best never to use that kind of theological language. But you can't look at that and call it anything else. But that's different in Europe. In Europe, they're still having a very difficult time, even theologically, coming to grips with what's here. So the answer for the church is the preaching of the gospel. We don't have an army. The answer is the preaching of the gospel, and that's incommensurate because they win by territory. We only win by hearts. I'm not sure that I have any intelligent answer for your question other than in terms of limiting the geographic military expansionist goals of something like the Islamic State, which really does have the goal. And if you're in that part of the world as I've been, they really do have the goal of raising the black flag over the White House. I mean, that they are that crazy. The only military answer to this is going to be the West realizing it's in a survival battle, and even those nations that have tried to delude themselves for a number of years being awakened to this. There are some signs that's happening. But theologically, we're the church. That's not our battle. And so we only have Ephesians 6. I mean, we're still left with a spiritual warfare in which we have the breastplate of righteousness and the shoes of the gospel and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And that's all we've got. And so we're in the same predicament that Justin Martyr and Augustine spoke of in the early church, where we are Christians. And as Augustine said, Christendom is falling, but not the church.
Derek?
Well, I was going to ask you a question about how this reflects the failure of radical feminism, that there are women prepared to do this.
Well,
Recount the story that we were talking about in the office earlier this morning about the folks leaving from Britain and going and the advertisements that are being made.
Right. This is I talked about this on the briefing yesterday. It's a story that emerged from the Telegraph, in which it turns out that there are a significant number of British teenage Muslim girls missing. And as people try to figure out where they've gone, it turns out they have joined the Islamic State to be jihad wives. Because through social media, the Islamic State, which at this point is an army without a country, they're simply an army. It's like I was saying, it's like the Roman legions without Rome. And they realize that they've got to become a culture. And they also have young soldiers who want wives. So they put out advertisements for wives, and their advertisements are, come join jihad, be a jihad wife, marry one of our jihad soldiers, and they're about 17 to 19, marry them, cook for him, and become his wife and the mother of his children, and they're leaving
Glasgow.
They're leaving
Edinburgh,
nice middle-class
London.
neighborhoods in Great Britain and joining jihad. And it's because feminism simply doesn't answer what women actually want when they're given the option. The Washington Post this week had another very interesting story when it turned out, when you're looking at the delay of marriage and the marginalization of marriage in American society, and you say, why are people not getting married? Well, when this massive study was done asking young women why they have not married, and then they asked, well, if you're not married, what is it you're looking for? Guess what they said? A man with a job. That is profoundly important. That's Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They're looking for a man that looks at least something like Genesis 1:28. And you look at that and you say, well, that's not modern feminism. You know, Gloria Steinem's word was, you know, that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Well, you not only have teenage girls in Great Britain saying, evidently, this fish needs a bicycle, but but you've also got millions of American young women in their 20s saying, what do you really want? And they go, a bicycle, you know, a man with a job. And so, that, you know, feminism, and it's just like the greatest rebellion we're facing against creation right now is the transgender movement. That whole thing of preferred gender pronoun and all the rest, that you are who you declare yourself to be, there's no binary nature between man and woman and all the rest. And even the secular world is panicking because they don't know how to talk about a person independent of gender. So even the gender revolutionaries can't do this. You also have a direct conflict right now. This is one of the most fascinating things to watch. You know, every once in a while, worldview conflict is a spectator sport in which you just step back and say, this is going to be interesting. Okay, so one of the greatest battles on the American university campus, and this I mean the far left university campus, which means your university campus, is this. You have feminists who say that a man who transitions to a woman is still exercising male privilege by having the option of transitioning to a woman. And so if you are not a woman who is biologically female at birth, then you are still exercising male privilege. And thus, one of the big controversies is, you know, what do you do to historic women's college? Do you let someone in who's transitioning? So the way they are now, and this was just recently, in this semester, several of them have announced, we will allow a woman who's here to transition to be a man, but we will not let in any man who's transitioning to be a woman. Others said, no, that's discriminatory. The only person we want to allow in is someone who was born a man who now thinks he's a man. And you look at this and you think, this can't work. And it is a spectator sport. And so the battle between the revolutionaries and the more radical revolutionaries and the even more radical revolutionaries just shows, you know, the feminism, that's the other problem, and I'll stop at this. All of these intellectual revolutions have no end point. So the sexual revolutionaries who say, look, this will stop with same-sex marriage, they have to know it won't. I mean, in Utah in 2013, in 1 week, federal judge struck down their marriage amendment, another federal judge struck down their law against polygamy. And people say that's a slippery slope argument. Just remember that slippery slope arguments are arguments with effect but no causation. We provide the causation. In other words, if you say, because Ligon falls off this platform, then you know, it's inevitable that we would fall too, that'd be a slippery slope argument. But if you say, if the platform collapses, all three of us are going to fall, that's not a slippery slope argument. That's an argument of cause and effect. And that's where we are on these issues. These are cause and effect arguments. You legalize same-sex marriage, you're going to be legalizing a lot of other things coming very quickly. And there's no end to that. Germany, just in the last 10 days, a German government committee has said that the nation must decriminalize incest because the right, and this is their term, to sexual self-determination trumps even public health concerns about incest. You look at that and you say, okay, this can't end there. You know, eventually this whole revolution unravels, and so forgive me, but that feminism is doing the same thing. The feminists are now at war with themselves.
One word of hope and encouragement about Islam is that the radical kind of Wahhabi Islam that sort of catches the attention of the news and is engaged in this active jihad is having a detrimental effect on the expansion of Islam outside of the Middle East in the global two-thirds world. And we are actually seeing conversions from Islam to Christianity in greater numbers than ever in the history of Islam. So in 13 centuries, we haven't seen the numbers of conversions of Muslims to Christianity. And part of that is we have very brave missionaries that are willing to go into cultural settings where they literally risk their lives to share the gospel, where it's illegal to convert to Christ. And inside Iran right now, which is a heretical Islamic state, you understand that Muslims hate heretics even more than they hate infidels, and so Sunni Muslims hate Shiite Islam. I was on a plane from after teaching at RTS Orlando a couple of weeks ago on the way to Macon, Georgia to preach, and a Pakistani Muslim was sitting in the seat next to me on the plane, and he is part of a heretical Muslim group that is persecuted and is one of the few protected groups that the U.S. government tries to seek shelter from majority Sunni Islam. And so, but because of that, it's opened a window for the gospel in the Shiite world. And we're seeing Muslims in very large numbers, no matter where you chart those numbers, larger numbers than ever before come to faith in Christ. So this will be a conflict of at least the next half century, I think, at least. But there is a lot of gospel hope. Al and I have a friend in a state in the Middle East with thriving Christian churches, seeing Muslims come to faith in Christ all the time and join that congregation.
Interesting, though, they're mostly not Arab Muslims. And this is one of the great untold stories of global missions right now. The way to reach Indonesian Muslims is in the Gulf states.
Yes.
The way to reach Pakistanis is in London.
Yes.
And so it's just an amazing, this is like the Apostle Paul with the globe scattered. Where you go to Rome, you find Romans. Well, now you go to Rome and you find Somalis.
Now you go to Minneapolis and find
That's right.
Pakistanis.
That's right.
And then outside of that cultural context
right.
of radicalism, you have an opportunity to engage for the gospel that would be hard
It's
to.
one of the reasons why one missiologist I know and love on our faculty says there actually are no closed countries. They're just closed borders.
Yes.
Because those people send their people out. If you get to them, they take the gospel back. And that's really powerful.
That's good. There was another hand. Yes, Addison.
As a father of two daughters, given our cultural moment, what are some concrete ways that I can raise them in the fear and the admonition of the Lord, given these cultural pressures?
Well, the very fact you want to do it is the start. And the very fact you frame it in that way is a significant advance. But it gets back to what I tried to say last night, which is we can't raise, look, okay, there's a Southern novelist by the name of Pharoah Sams, died not too long ago. Not who you expected to be named here. But, and I'm not exactly commending his books, all right? But,
Although they are really funny.
yeah, and he does nail the South and Southern Baptists.
And Methodists.
Yes, but I like the book partly because he said for every young boy in the South being raised, the word seminary in Louisville had the same ring as temple in Jerusalem. I do like that. But in it, he nails it because I grew up in that society and I understand it. And he talks about what the false gospel of moralism. He doesn't name it that, but that's what it is. And he says, look, every Southern parent's main concern is that their children were raised right. Put that in quotation marks. And being raised right meant that you weren't raising a rebel. You were raising someone that was going to grow up and be a good insurance agent, or someone that wasn't going to bring scandal in the family. You have to raise a counterinsurgency. You have to raise counter-revolutionaries. Raised right is a whole civilization ago. And so I would simply say you got to raise daughters, and we have to raise sons who are who understand themselves to be guerrilla soldiers, being raised to go out as counterinsurgents, counter-revolutionaries. Because if that's not their identity, it's going to be, if they don't have an identity, not just arguments, if they don't have an identity that we're not that, then they will be that. Because the ambient culture is so powerful.
That's good. Yes.
Well, I have a couple questions I'm trying to decide, but I think I want to ask you about I'm a full-time evangelist, so I'm always astonished that the Muslims think they'd be most effective to hold a machete at your neck and say, convert now or die, without giving them a second to think about it. And we know that a person persuaded against their will is of the same persuasion still. Would they not be more effective if they began to share the advantages of Islam and the strengths and the love of Allah? And, I don't know. It just seems like crazy.
Do you want to speak to that? The mode?
Yeah, you've got a huge problem, and that's you're thinking like a Christian, which has almost nothing to do with thinking like a Muslim. I mean, for instance, Muslims don't do systematic theology. They don't have their theology has two principles. There's no God but Allah. Muhammad is his prophet. Period.
You're done with Muslims.
The institutes of the Muslim religion.
Yeah.
Islam is not primarily a cognitive faith. You never hear in Islam that faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of Allah. That doesn't happen. It's obedience. The very word means submission. It is a way of life. No Muslim has a personal relationship with Allah. That's just not what they're looking at. Now, the last part of what you said is interesting because Islam's evangelism, insofar as it's there, is to point to a superior way of life. So one of the reasons why it has traction in a secularized Europe, because it comes in and says, look, here's how you find meaning in your life. Here's how you find a way to organize your family. Here's the role of women. Here's the role of men. And so it does have that effect, but it never comes with the kind of evangelistic impulse you have. It's simply, okay, so here's what you do to be a faithful Muslim. Here are the 5 pillars of Islam. Here's how you obey. Here's what you do. And so, yeah, you're thinking like a Christian on the other. They are concerned. The last thing I'll simply say is that Islam in the Quran separates the world between the world of war and the world of Islam. It is territorial conquest. Its conquest means people inside it who live under Sharia law, by the fact they live under Sharia law, are Muslims, unless they either apostatize or they're recognized as Jews and Christians are, as people of the book under the word I used last night is the French word translating the Muslim concept dimitude, which is under submission to Muslim authority. Jews and Christians can live under submission to Muslim authority.
I am going to have to take Dr. Mohler and Dr. Thomas to the airport very soon. But I have copies of Dr. Mohler's book, The Conviction to Lead. And if the leaders in the room and the leaders to be in the room would like to have a copy of this book, I've got a stack of them up here. And first come, first serve. And we'll stay around for maybe 10 minutes if you want Dr. Mohler to sign your copy of his book. And then I'm going to have to pull him out of the room and get him on the way to the airport. Thank you, friends, so much for being with us this morning.